Welcome to Lecture 23, where we will go over the important concepts in examining the ecology of populations. There are many factors that can affect populations over time. These include factors such as birth rate, immigration rate, which add species to a population, as well as death rate and emigration rates, which will remove species or individuals from a population. Over time, this may cause a population to reach a stable size, fluctuate, or rise and fall in regular cycles. A population is defined as a group of individuals that belong to the same species and also are living within the same geographic area. These individuals will utilize similar resources, interact with each other, and can also be influenced by the same environmental factors. Abiotic as well as biotic factors will affect a population's density, dispersal, as well as demographics. We will now take a look at each of these individual factors. Density refers to the number of individuals contained within an area. With respect to populations in the wild, density is not considered to be constant and can change over time as well as space. In general, individuals will be added to a population by reproduction through the action of birth into a population as well as immigration. Individuals in general are removed from a population by death or by emigration. In general, emigration can lead to a reduction in population size. However, it can also lead to the establishment of new populations if they expand, colonize, and establish themselves in different regions. Another important characteristic of populations is examining the dispersal pattern. Dispersion refers to the distribution patterns of individuals that occur over a specific area. The distribution of individuals within a population can be clumped, as we see to the left, uniform, as well as random. In a clump distribution, individuals will aggregate near food sources or in optimal habitats. In a uniform distribution, the individuals are spaced uniformly throughout an area. This typically results when there's territorial behavior or aggression that causes individuals to maintain themselves at certain distances. A random distribution pattern occurs typically when individuals are subject to wind for dispersal patterns. Demographics can be very important in understanding how certain properties of a population change over time and space. To understand the demographics of a population, life tables are typically used. These life tables can track changes in survival and reproductive rates. This is because they typically involve tracking a group of individuals or cohort through the population. The cohort individuals will all have a similar age or reproductive status. In addition, sometimes within a population, only the females are tracked. This is because they are responsible for reproducing. If we take a look to the diagram to the right, we can see a life table for female ground squirrels in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. Take a look at the different age groups. Also take a look at the number alive at the start of the year, the proportion of individuals that are alive. Note that we begin at 100% because this begins our tracking of the population. We also note the death rate can change over time following the cohort from 0 to 1 all the way to 9 to 10 years. Also note that the average number of female offspring may fluctuate over time. All of these aspects will give a general idea of how many individuals are added to a population as well as removed from the population. This will give a good idea of what is occurring to the population over time. Within the study of demographics, survivorship curves can be generated. These curves represent the proportion of individuals that are alive at the various age groups. Usually this begins at 1,000, as seen in the diagram on the previous slide, or table in the previous slide. This is usually estimated from raw numbers of individuals that are present in the population. These are typically surveyed by researchers or ecologists. Survival in general depends on factors such as environmental factors, if there is parental care, biotic and abiotic factors. Take a look at the diagram to the right to understand the survivorship curve of the ground squirrel. This is depicted and was constructed from the data in the table in the previous slide. If we take a look at survivorship curves in general, there are three main types of curves that are usually existent within populations: Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. A Type 1 curve is also present within human populations. Type 1 curves result when there are low death rates in early or midlife and higher death rates that increase with age. Type 2 curves typically exist when a population or group of individuals have steady death rates. Type 3 curves, on the other hand, have high mortality rates early on within the population, and this mortality will decrease with age. Although we have three distinct survivorship curves here, many species will actually fall in between these ideal curves. In addition, populations may exhibit multiple trends that are present within these curves throughout different life stages. Another important aspect to consider when considering the demographics of a population is considering the reproductive rate. Reproductive rates are typically determined by examining females in the population. It is usually expressed as the number of female offspring that are produced by females within the population. Also note that if a population exhibits a different reproductive pattern, meaning that the females are not the only ones that can reproduce, then this should be reflected in the reproductive rate. As a result, studying only females in that specific population may not be appropriate. In addition, many species can have age-specific reproductive rates that change over time. For instance, oak trees can produce thousands of acorns for hundreds of years throughout their lifetime, exhibiting a more steady state reproductive rate that doesn't change, while bottlenose dolphins, as seen to the left here, reproduce specifically between the ages of 6 to 13. In addition, they only have 1 to 2 calves at each reproductive event, thus exhibiting an age-specific reproductive rate. As they expand their lifespan past 13 years, there are very few of those females that are able to reproduce. Also note that just because a population has a high reproductive rate, this does not always lead to population growth, as the death rate and emigration rate will also become important in leading to growth in a population. A high reproductive rate can lead to population growth if the requirements for growth and survival are ideal for the individuals and subsequently for the population as a whole. Overall, a change in population size is reflective of the number of births, the number of new individuals or immigrants being added to the population, minus the number of deaths as well as the number of emigrants or individuals leaving the population. We're now going to take a look at different growth models that will estimate or explain the growth in population or changes in population size. We'll first begin with the exponential growth model. The exponential growth model describes population growth in ideal environments in the absence of limits for resources, reproduction, mate finding, etc. Exponential growth can be represented by the following formula. dn by dt, which is the rate of change in a population, equals r, the intrinsic rate of increase, as well as n, the current population size. If a population is growing exponentially, this means that it will increase at a constant rate per individual or per female. This usually causes a J-shaped growth curve when population size is plotted over time or the number of generations. Exponential growth curves are typically present in many bacterial populations. As the number of individuals increases, there is a steep increase in the population size, thus giving the J-shaped curve. Also note that the higher the intrinsic rate of increase, or R value, the steeper the slope. Note the difference between the slope of the line when the R is equal to 1, which is depicted in blue in the diagram to the right, versus when R is 0.5, which is depicted in red. The steeper the slope, the faster the population will grow, as evident in the blue curve. The second population growth curve that we will examine is the logistic growth curve. A logistic growth model considers that there are specific limits that will be exerted on the growth of a population. This is reflected in the carrying capacity, or K value, of a population. As a population increases, one of the main limiting factors could be resources. Resources typically limit the number of individuals that can be present within a population. Resource limitation can decrease birth and survival rates, thus slowing population growth. According to the logistic growth model, the rate of growth of a population, or dn by dt, equals Rn, the intrinsic rate, multiplied by the number of individuals present. This factor or variable is then multiplied by k minus n over k. Thus, the carrying capacity of the population becomes a very important determining factor in predicting the population size at a given time point. Though resources may be one of the main factors that limits the growth of a population, it is not the only one. Other factors such as the number or quality of habitat, nesting sites, availability of water and nutrients, the availability of shelter or refugia from predators, competition, and also decreasing birth rate and increasing death rate will also act to limit a population. Note the diagram to the right. We have an exponential growth curve where the intrinsic rate of growth is 1.0. In the red line here, we have the logistic growth model. Note that with the logistic growth model, we have the same intrinsic rate of growth of 1.0. Also note that in this model, we have a carrying capacity of about 1,500 individuals. Note that the population growth will increase much like the exponential growth curve. However, there is a point in the graph in which the population growth rate begins to slow. This occurs as the population approaches the carrying capacity. There are a few population growth trends that can be noted from the logistic growth model. Specifically, when n is a lot less than k, this means that the population size is well below the carrying capacity. This means that according to the formula, k minus n over k approaches a value of 1. This means that the dn by dt value is going to be very close to the exponential growth model. As a result, this reflects the bottom half of the red curve. When n is less than k or is approaching k, this means that the population size is now approaching the carrying capacity. When this occurs, the value of k minus n over k approaches 0. This means, with respect to the growth size, the growth of the population, the per capita growth rate is extremely small. As a result, the population growth will slow. This is noted in the middle part of the red curve. When n equals k, this means that k minus n over k is also equal to 0. This means that dn over dt, or the population growth rate, will be 0. This means that the population is no longer growing at this point. Note the table to the left that shows data points that illustrate these concepts, as well as the diagram to the right that shows you the different growth in the different ranges when n is much less than k, when n approaches k, and when n equals k, or the population is at the carrying capacity. Note that the logistic population growth model is very applicable, specifically when many small species are reared in lab. Many of these species, such as paramecium and insects, will exhibit logistic growth if they're reared with a fixed set of resources, and they are also in the absence of any predators, competitors, or disease. Lab populations of the paramecium, seen to the left, grown in a constant environment, very closely fits the logistic growth curve. Many species, such as Daphnia, in the lab or in the wild, do not respond immediately to limiting food supplies. This means that in reality, their population size may overshoot the carrying capacity before normalizing to that threshold. In nature, there are many more variables to consider, and populations may fluctuate over time and space. Thus, populations in the wild may never reach a true carrying capacity, or they may not fit a specific growth curve like exponential or the logistic growth curve that we've examined here. Based on this, we may ask ourselves, why do we even use these growth models? In fact, the logistic growth model provides a very useful starting point to model population growth. Important variables that are important for specific populations can then be added or removed from the equation to better predict the population growth or change of population size over time. The logistic growth model can be adjusted by adding and removing variables. These variables oftentimes are very specific to certain populations. The model can also be used to estimate sustainable levels for hunting and harvesting by defining the death rate as well as the emigration rate and ensuring that these variables do not cause the population size to decrease. Logistic growth models can also be used to predict population growth and are particularly useful in smaller populations. And in addition, these models can be used to estimate critical population size. These critical population size may be important in maintaining threatened or endangered species. For instance, the subspecies of white rhino is currently on the verge of extinction, demonstrating the importance of knowing what a critical population size is in order to conserve as well as sustain threatened and endangered species.